May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across London, Paris, and New York, church bells rang, flags waved, and strangers kissed in the streets. For millions, it was the end of nearly 6 years of bloodshed. In America, newspapers shouted the headline in letters so large they could be read from across a street corner: "Germany surrenders." Families poured out of their homes, soldiers on leave marched proudly in impromptu parades, and factory whistles blew in triumph. But hundreds of miles away from the roaring cities and jubilant crowds, there were places where the news fell with a very different weight. On quiet farmland in Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, where the endless rows of cornfields and prairie grass whispered in the wind, the war's end was marked not with champagne but with a single, simple announcement. Inside camps surrounded by barbed wire, where German prisoners of war had lived for months or even years, American officers gathered the men and women together. These officers were not dressed for ceremony. Their uniforms bore the dust and sweat of long service. Their faces were weary, but their voices carried authority, and with words as heavy as stone they declared, "You can go home." The moment should have been filled with joy. After years of captivity, the prisoners had finally been granted the one thing they had dreamed about: release. The gates that had kept them locked away would soon open. Freedom, in theory, was theirs. Yet instead of cheers, laughter, and a rush to the gates, silence followed. The silence of confusion, the silence of fear. Among those standing in formation were dozens of young women, secretaries, nurses, typists, and auxiliaries who had once served in Germany's war machine. Some were barely out of their teens, others were in their 30s, carrying the weary look of women who had seen too much destruction already. They exchanged glances, their expressions not of relief, but of hesitation. Some bowed their heads, others whispered quietly in German, "Nein. No." The officers were stunned. Prisoners had begged for release before, had dreamed of it, had schemed for it. But here, in the heartland of America, on the very day that Europe celebrated liberation, these women refused it. The words, "You can go home," were supposed to mean salvation. Instead, they landed like a cruel joke. One officer in Texas later recalled, "I thought they would run to the gate. Instead, some of them cried. And it wasn't happiness, it was something heavier. What could possibly make a prisoner choose captivity over freedom? To understand, we need to step back in time, back to the propaganda that shaped their fears, back to the long Atlantic crossing that brought them to America, and back to the shocking contrast between what they had been taught and what they actually found. Because this story isn't just about women behind barbed wire. It's about how war can twist the very meaning of words like home and freedom. It's about how, in the rubble of Europe, captivity in America could feel like the only refuge left. And so, on that spring morning in 1945, as the rest of the world celebrated, these women faced a terrible choice: walk out of camp into the ruins of Germany, or remain behind the fences of their conquerors, where meals were certain and safety still existed. That choice, and the heartbreak that came with it, is where our story truly begins. When we think of German prisoners of war in America, most imagine hardened soldiers, Afrika Korps veterans, U-boat crews, or Luftwaffe pilots. Yet among the hundreds of thousands shipped across the Atlantic were women. Not many, but enough to leave behind stories that still baffle historians today. They were not frontline warriors. Most had never fired a rifle in anger. Instead, they were secretaries, telephone operators, nurses, typists, or clerks, women who worked in the shadow of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Their tasks had been simple: typing reports, filing records, patching soldiers' wounds, or operating switchboards deep inside command bunkers. But war is a flood, and once it breaks the dikes, it sweeps away everyone in its path. When the Allies advanced, these women found themselves captured alongside the men. Some had stayed too close to combat units. Others were accused of being part of military organizations, even if they had only worn a uniform to work an office job. By 1944, suspicion was enough. If you served in or around the German armed forces, you could be shipped away. And so they came. Across the ocean, aboard gray-painted Liberty ships, their voyage was filled with dread. Nazi propaganda had drilled fear into them. America was the land of brutes, a place where prisoners would be starved, beaten, and treated like animals. Women especially were told to expect humiliation, even violence, if they fell into enemy hands. Imagine the terror of a 22-year-old nurse, torn from a field hospital in France, placed on a troop ship, and told she was going to a prison in the United States. She left behind family she might never see again, not knowing if her hometown still stood. To her, the Atlantic felt like an endless barrier between the life she had known and a terrifying unknown. But what awaited them in America was not what they had been led to believe. When they disembarked in Norfolk, New York, or New Orleans, they were not met with clubs or chains. They were processed with efficiency, photographed, documented, and explained their rights under the Geneva Convention, often by officers who spoke German. Then came the train ride into the American heartland. Instead of cattle cars, as they might have expected from how their own army had treated prisoners, they traveled in passenger coaches with padded seats and dining cars. For some, the trip across America was their first glimpse of a land that seemed impossibly abundant. The Midwest became their cage, but also their strange new home. Camps in Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Kansas held thousands of prisoners. The women were separated from men, but their lives followed similar routines. Rising at dawn, assigned to light work, and always under the watchful eye of guards. Yet within weeks, fear began to melt into astonishment. Food was plentiful. Clothes were clean. Some even received brand new shoes, an item most hadn't owned since the early years of the war. The conditions contrasted so sharply with what they had left behind in Germany that they almost felt guilty for enjoying them. One young woman scribbled in her diary about peanut butter, calling it sticky and strange, yet irresistible. Another recalled the shock of tasting fresh fruit, something she hadn't seen since 1941. To us today, these are simple details. To them, it was a revelation. Still, the women never forgot who they were. Germans, captives in a foreign land, cut off from family. Letters that trickled through the censors reminded them of home. But home was no longer the place they had once known. Bombed-out neighborhoods, families torn apart, brothers missing on the Eastern Front, mothers starving in ruined cities. Every letter that reached them carried both hope and heartbreak. And so, these women became a paradox in human form. They were enemies of America, yet they lived lives that, in many ways, were safer and fuller than those of their own families back in Germany. They were prisoners, yet freer from fear than they had been in their homeland. This paradox would soon come to a head. Because when officers told them, "You can go home," the meaning of home had shifted. To some it meant ruins, to others it meant starvation, to still others it meant Soviet occupation, with rumors of violence and revenge spreading like wildfire. But before we reach that moment of decision, we must first understand daily life in the camps, the strange mixture of hardship, routine, and even small joys that shaped the women's experience in America. That is where our story leads next. Before their capture, these young German women carried not only uniforms and duties, but also an invisible burden, years of propaganda. From 1939 onward, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda painted the Allies, especially Americans, as brutal, uncivilized, and merciless. To fall into American hands, they were told, was worse than death. Pamphlets distributed among auxiliaries and nurses carried warnings. American soldiers have no honor. Teachers repeated tales of savagery. Radio broadcasts described the United States as a land of mongrels, a society too weak and chaotic to fight a modern war, yet cruel enough to destroy without pity. For the young women of Germany, this constant drumbeat left scars. Some genuinely believed that if captured, they would face starvation, abuse, or worse. Nurses whispered to each other that Allied troops would treat them as spoils of war. Secretaries feared being paraded through American towns as trophies. The image of America that had been drilled into their minds was one of darkness, not opportunity. So when their units collapsed and Allied soldiers surrounded them, terror struck harder than chains. On the docks of France and Belgium, waiting to be herded onto American ships, many wept silently. Some prayed, others clutched rosaries or letters from home. They did not know that the greatest journey of their lives was about to begin, not into hell as they feared, but into a paradox none of them could have imagined. And the voyage itself only deepened their dread. The Atlantic crossing lasted 2 weeks aboard gray-painted Liberty or troop ships. The vessels smelled of salt and oil, their decks crowded with soldiers and prisoners alike. Guards were stern but not cruel, yet suspicion lingered in every glance. At night, as the waves rocked the ships, the women whispered to each other in their bunks, "Will we survive this? What will they do to us in America?" And then came the first shock. Meals were served in mess lines, not lavish, but plentiful. Fresh bread, coffee, and even meat appeared on trays. Compared to the meager rations of Germany, where butter and sugar had long vanished from tables, these meals felt unreal. One prisoner later admitted, "We thought it was some trick. They wanted to fatten us before tormenting us." When the ships reached American shores, another surprise awaited. Processing centers were efficient, orderly, and, most of all, human. Officers who spoke fluent German explained the rules. Prisoners were registered, photographed, and informed of their Geneva Convention rights. To women who had been told to expect humiliation, this civility was disorienting. Then came the train rides inland. They braced for cattle cars, the same way their own country had shipped prisoners and deportees. Instead, they found cushioned Pullman coaches, complete with dining cars and sleeping berths. Some remembered the windows lit with electric lights all through the night, towns glowing with a brilliance unseen in Germany since the blackouts of 1940. The propaganda had cracked. It had promised darkness and brutality, but what they found was abundance and routine. Still, fear did not vanish overnight. Trust came slowly, shaped not by speeches but by daily life, by the guards who handed out extra rations, by the sound of accordions drifting from the barracks, by the laughter that began to return after long months of silence. For these women, captivity in America was not freedom, but it was not the nightmare they had been taught to expect. It was something stranger, something in between, a limbo that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. And it was within that limbo, surrounded by barbed wire, yet shielded from destruction, that they began to rebuild fragments of their humanity. Next, we will step inside the camps themselves, to see what life was truly like for the German women behind American fences, and why the routine of captivity sometimes felt more like salvation than punishment. When the women first arrived at the camps scattered across Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Kansas, their nerves were raw. They expected hunger, punishment, and humiliation. Instead, what greeted them were orderly barracks, clean bedding, and meals that seemed far too generous for prisoners of war. The first shock was food. One young woman, not yet 23, recorded in her diary that she was given something sticky, sweet, and utterly strange: peanut butter. At first she grimaced, then she took another bite, and another. Soon, she admitted she couldn't stop eating it. To us today, peanut butter is as American as apple pie. But to a German prisoner in 1944, it was a bizarre, exotic luxury, proof of a land where food seemed endless. There were potatoes, boiled, mashed, or fried, served in quantities they hadn't seen since before the war. There was coffee, hot and black, not the bitter ersatz brew made from roasted barley or acorns back home. There was bread, soft and white, not the coarse, dark loaves stretched with sawdust and fillers that had become common in Germany. And there was sugar, bowls of it on mess hall tables, to be scooped freely into coffee or sprinkled over oatmeal. For women who had grown up with strict ration cards, where a spoonful of sugar was a rare treasure, the sight of unlimited sweetness was almost unbelievable. The second shock was clothing. In one Iowa camp, a former Luftwaffe secretary remembered being handed a brand new pair of shoes upon arrival. She had not owned new footwear since 1941. In Germany, shoes were patched, resoled, stitched, and stitched again until they finally fell apart. To be given fresh leather shoes without begging, without black market trades, felt almost indecent. She later told a Red Cross worker, "I felt guilty. I was the enemy, and yet they gave me more than my own country ever could." Then there were the little things. Soap that lathered richly, toothpaste in neat metal tubes, cotton dresses that fit properly, even if plain. For women who had lived with scarcity for years, these everyday items felt like treasures. Some wrote home cautiously, careful not to praise their captors too openly for fear of censorship. But between the lines, their astonishment bled through. One letter smuggled back to Hamburg mentioned, "We are fed as if we are guests, not prisoners." Another whispered, "The guards give us apples from the orchards. I bit into one, and it tasted of peace." It wasn't just the material comforts that stunned them. It was the contrast. They knew that back in Germany, mothers were boiling nettles for soup. Children were shivering in bombed-out apartments. Shoes were worn until they disintegrated. Sugar was a dream. And yet here, in the land of their enemy, they had more than they ever imagined. At first, this abundance created unease. To enjoy it felt like betrayal. Some women even refused certain foods, afraid it was a trick. Others ate with tears in their eyes, torn between gratitude and guilt. Slowly, though, routine softened the strangeness. Meals were eaten, work was assigned, days found rhythm. Guards were watchful, but rarely cruel. In fact, many were barely older than the prisoners themselves, American farm boys in uniform who looked at these German women with something closer to pity than hatred. And amid this cautious new reality, laughter began to return. One farm family in Kansas, watching the German women labor in the fields, remembered them joking in broken English, "America has more corn than soldiers." Even the guards chuckled at that. It was not freedom, but it was not misery either. For women who had expected brutality, the camps of America were instead a strange, bittersweet refuge. They were still prisoners, but the fences now felt less threatening than the world waiting beyond them. What they could not yet know was that these small shocks, the peanut butter, the shoes, the sugar bowls, were the first steps in a profound transformation. The more they compared life behind American fences to what awaited in war-torn Germany, the more captivity itself began to look like safety. And soon, letters from home would confirm their worst fears, that returning to Germany was not a journey to family and hearth, but to rubble, hunger, and despair. That revelation would turn the officer's simple words, "You can go home," into a source of dread rather than relief. But before we reach that heartbreaking moment, we must see how daily life unfolded inside the camps, the work, the music, the small acts of kindness that made survival possible. By the summer of 1944, the German women had settled into routines that felt nothing like the nightmare they had imagined during their Atlantic crossing. Life behind the barbed wire fences was still captivity, but it carried a rhythm, almost a strange imitation of normal life. The mornings began with the clang of a bell. The women would rise from wooden bunks, the air heavy with the smell of boiled coffee drifting from the guards' quarters. They washed quickly, pulled on plain cotton dresses or work clothes, and lined up for breakfast, often potatoes, oatmeal, and bread thickly spread with butter. Some still whispered disbelief that they could eat until they were full. Then came the work details. In Texas, many were assigned to the camp kitchens, peeling endless mountains of potatoes in the humid air. In Iowa, they were sent out under guard to work the farms, bending in the fields to pull sugar beets, their hands blistering under the sun. Kansas farmers, at first suspicious, watched carefully from their porches. What they saw surprised them. Instead of sabotage or defiance, the women labored earnestly. Some even laughed at the size of the fields, joking in halting English, "Too much corn." More corn than soldiers. The guards chuckled, the farmers shook their heads, and slowly suspicion gave way to something like respect. Afternoons passed with lighter duties, mending uniforms, cleaning, or sometimes attending classes organized by the camp. The U.S. Army had realized that keeping prisoners occupied was better than leaving them idle. And so, German women found themselves reading books, learning bits of English, even writing essays under the watchful eye of supervisors. But it was the evenings that carved the deepest memories. When the day's labor ended and the prairie sun dipped low, music often floated from the barracks. Accordions, smuggled across the Atlantic or scavenged somehow, played songs from the homeland. At first, the music was tinged with homesickness, haunting melodies that made some cry silently in their bunks. But soon, laughter crept in. Voices rose in choruses, sometimes in German, sometimes in broken English, the sound carrying over the fences into the still American night. One young American sergeant later admitted, "They looked so young, you forgot they were the enemy." At night, when the music came, it didn't sound German or American, it just sounded human. Small acts of kindness became part of daily life. A guard slipped an apple to a prisoner during a long day in the fields. Another taught a young woman a few English words, laughing when she mispronounced them. These moments did not erase the war, but they softened it. Of course, not all was peace. The fences were real, the guards armed, the rules strict. Escape attempts, though rare among the women, were punished severely, and always there was the nagging uncertainty. When the war ended, what would happen to them? Yet within those fences, a fragile stability took hold. Meals came regularly, the work was hard but survivable. Music and laughter returned in small doses, and for many of the women, captivity in America felt safer, kinder even, than the freedom that awaited them back in Germany. But safety is fragile, and it could not last forever. Letters from home would soon pierce that fragile peace, carrying news that shattered illusions. For the German women, home was no longer a place of warmth and family. It had become a place of ruins and hunger. And those letters would explain why, when American officers finally said the words, "You can go home," many of the women wept and begged to stay. For months, the German women in American camps lived in a strange contradiction. They were prisoners, yes, but they ate well, worked hard, and even laughed again. The fences that surrounded them no longer symbolized terror. They felt, in a twisted way, like protection. But then came the letters. At first, they arrived slowly. Every piece of mail passed through censors, often delayed for weeks. The handwriting on those envelopes was shaky, the ink often smudged, as if written by trembling hands in candlelight. When the guards finally called out names during mail call, the women rushed forward, clutching thin scraps of paper that carried the voices of home. The words inside were rarely comforting. One letter, read aloud in the dim barracks by a young woman of 26, brought silence over the entire room. Hamburg is no longer a city. Entire streets are rubble. Mother is starving. Your brother is missing in Russia. We do not know if father is alive. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it broke halfway through. Around her, women wept quietly, their faces turned to the wooden walls so the guards wouldn't see. Another note from Dresden described walking through blackened skeletons of houses, the stench of fire still lingering months after the bombs. It spoke of neighbors vanishing, of children digging through ruins for crusts of bread. Still another from the Soviet zone carried an even darker warning. We hear stories of terrible things, women dragged from their homes, assaults in the night, We pray you never return here. Each letter confirmed the nightmare the women had feared. Home was no longer home. It was rubble, hunger, and terror. The contrast was unbearable. In Iowa, they ate full meals. In Kansas, they were given apples by sympathetic guards. In Texas, they worked the fields but slept safely in their barracks. And yet, their mothers and sisters in Germany faced starvation. Children begged in the streets. The very towns these women had once dreamed of returning to were now little more than ashes. Some prisoners tried to write back with words of comfort, though they knew their letters might never reach their loved ones. Others sat in silence, staring at the paper, unable to put their despair into words. One woman confessed in her diary, "I feel ashamed that I am safe here while they suffer there. Yet I am terrified to return. My heart is split in two, and neither side feels whole." The officers who delivered the mail began to notice the change. Instead of joy, mail call was often followed by tears. Instead of hope, letters carried dread. The women read them late into the night, the dim bulbs of the barracks casting long shadows on their faces. And so the seed of resistance was planted. When the time finally came for the officers to announce, "You can go home," the women would not hear freedom in those words. They would hear only the echo of their letters. The starving mother, the missing brother, the streets turned to rubble, the rumors of Soviet vengeance. To the Americans, repatriation was a duty. To the German women, it looked like exile into a nightmare. The stage was set for a moment that would stun even battle-hardened American officers, prisoners begging to remain behind the very barbed wire that was supposed to hold them captive. Spring 1945. The war was over. In Europe, bells rang and flags waved. In America, crowds filled the streets with joy. But inside the quiet prison camps of the Midwest, victory was marked in a different way. The prisoners were called together. Dust rose as boots shuffled across gravel. The women, nurses, clerks, secretaries, auxiliaries, stood in formation, their faces taut with anticipation. American officers, their uniforms worn from long service, stepped forward. The order had come down from Washington. Prisoners would be repatriated. The words were short, almost casual. "You can go home." For a heartbeat, silence. Then another. The officers waited for the eruption of cheers, the rush to the gates, the joyful chaos they expected. Instead, they were met with something entirely different. A hush fell over the camp. Women exchanged glances, eyes downcast, lips trembling. One or two whispered, "9." Others shook their heads. And then, to the astonishment of the guards, some began to cry, not from relief, but from despair. A captain in Texas later remembered, "I thought they'd run for the trains." Instead, some of them clung to each other and sobbed. It was the strangest sight I ever witnessed. The officers repeated themselves, as though the meaning had somehow been lost in translation. "You can go home." But a woman at the front of the group lifted her chin, her German accent heavy as she forced the words out in halting English. "Home! No home left!" The sentence cut like a knife. The Americans, who had been trained to see prisoners as enemies, stood bewildered. They had offered freedom, yet here was the enemy begging to remain in chains. The truth was painfully simple. For these women, home no longer meant family waiting at the doorstep or warm kitchens filled with bread. Home now meant rubble, hunger, and fear. Some had no families left at all. Others dreaded the Soviet occupation zones, where rumors of violence spread like wildfire. Going home meant stepping into chaos, into a Germany that barely existed anymore. A young guard in Iowa later wrote to his parents, "I never thought I'd see the day when the enemy asked me to keep them prisoners, but some of the girls cried when they thought of going back. They are safer here than free out there." It was a moment that turned the world upside down. For months, these women had lived behind barbed wire. They had eaten American food, worn American shoes, listened to American music drifting over the camp. And though they were captives, They had come to trust the rhythm of life inside the fences more than the ruins beyond them. The irony was staggering. Nazi propaganda had once painted America as a land of monsters. Yet here, in the land of their conquerors, these women felt more secure than in the country of their birth. Freedom had become something to fear, while captivity had become a strange form of refuge. The officers were left stunned. Their orders were clear: repatriation. But in camp after camp, they faced prisoners, women prisoners, who begged to remain. Each refusal was not about loyalty to Germany, but terror of what Germany had become. The phrase, "you can go home," was supposed to signal liberation. Instead, it revealed the deepest wound of the war, that for millions, there was no home left to return to. That moment of refusal was more than just a scene in a prison yard. It was proof that war had not only destroyed cities and armies, it had broken the very idea of home itself. The refusal of freedom shocked the American officers, but for the German women, the reasoning was painfully clear. Going home did not mean stepping back into familiar streets or warm kitchens. It meant stepping into ruins. Germany in 1945 was unrecognizable. Allied bombing had leveled cities once filled with music, marketplaces, and church bells. Hamburg was a blackened skeleton. Dresden lay in ashes. Cologne's cathedral stood defiant but surrounded by rubble. Berlin, the once proud capital, was a hollow carcass, its streets filled with broken glass and the hungry faces of orphans. Every letter the women received confirmed the same story. There was no bread, no coal, no safety. Families burned furniture to keep warm. Children scavenged for potato peels. Mothers went without food so their little ones could survive another day. But hunger and rubble were not the only fears. There was the Soviet shadow. For those whose homes lay in the east, in Silesia, East Prussia, or Saxony, the stories were terrifying. Whispers of Soviet soldiers marching into towns, taking what they pleased, spread quickly through the camps. Tales of looting, assault, and revenge haunted the prisoners. Some women trembled at the thought of stepping off a train only to face the Red Army. Even in the West, fear was constant. Would they return to find strangers in their homes? Would they be punished as collaborators simply for having served as clerks or nurses? Would their neighbors shun them, or worse? One woman in a Texas camp summed it up in a single sentence to her American guard: "At least here, I know I will eat tomorrow." It was not gratitude so much as grim logic. In America, even behind fences, they had stability. 3 meals a day, a roof over their heads, work that was hard but fair. Back in Germany, they expected only chaos. The irony cut deep. These women had been raised to believe Germany was their eternal homeland, their fortress of strength. Yet now, home felt like exile, while enemy soil offered security. The barbed wire that once symbolized imprisonment had become, in their minds, a shield. For the Americans, this realization was unsettling. They had defeated the enemy, but the enemy's women were begging to remain in American custody. It forced the guards and officers to see them not as faceless adversaries, but as human beings caught in the same storm of war. And so the officers recorded their refusals with bewildered pens. In camp reports, they scribbled notes like, "Some prisoners unwilling to return. State fear of conditions in Germany." It was a phenomenon no one had prepared for. Prisoners pleading to remain prisoners. Their fear was not irrational, it was survival. And it revealed a brutal truth of war, that sometimes freedom is more terrifying than captivity, and home is nothing but rubble and silence. By 1945, months of shared routines had begun to erode the barriers of hate. For the German women, the image of America as a land of cruelty had already shattered the moment they tasted fresh bread and received new shoes. For the American guards, the enemy stopped being faceless the first time they saw tears fall over a letter from Hamburg or Dresden. Day after day, small gestures began to redraw the lines of war. A sergeant in Iowa remembered how one prisoner, trying to practice English, shyly offered him a thank you when he handed her an extra apple. He laughed, corrected her pronunciation, and the two shared a moment of warmth that propaganda on either side had never allowed. Another guard recalled Christmas Eve in Kansas. The prisoners had fashioned decorations out of scraps of paper, twine, and pine cones gathered from the fields. When night came, they sang carols in German. The guards stood silently outside the barracks, listening. One recognized the melody. Silent Night. Different language. Same song. Before long, the Americans joined in, their voices blending across the wire. For a few brief minutes, there was no war, only music. The women, too, began to speak differently of their captors. At first, they had called them brutes, cowboys, or worse. But soon, diary entries told another story. One wrote, "The guards treat us fairly. Sometimes they seem embarrassed by our tears." Another admitted, "They are boys, not monsters. Some no older than my brother." Even among the local American communities, perceptions shifted. Farmers who had once resented the presence of enemy aliens working their fields began to see them as simply young women who labored hard and laughed easily. A Kansas farm wife recalled, "They were polite, respectful. They reminded me of my own daughters." Of course, the barbed wire never vanished. These women were still prisoners. But within that confinement grew a strange sense of humanity, an unspoken understanding that the labels of enemy and ally did not capture the whole truth. For many American guards, this realization left a deep impression. They had seen German soldiers as fierce opponents on the battlefield. Yet here, in the quiet of the Midwest, they saw the other side of war. Women who had lost families, who longed for safety, who clung to life in the same way anyone would. One lieutenant later said, "War makes us believe the enemy is less than human. But watching those women, I realized we are the same. They feared hunger, they missed their mothers, they prayed for peace, just like us." This shift in perception mattered. It did not erase the war, nor the crimes committed in Europe, but it planted seeds of empathy. It showed that even in the darkest chapters of history, human connection could survive. And it explains why, when the order came to send them home, the women's tears touched the guards so deeply. The Americans no longer saw prisoners refusing freedom. They saw people terrified of what awaited them beyond the wire. The barbed wire, once a symbol of division, had become something unexpected, a place where enemies glimpsed the humanity in each other. The day of reckoning could not be postponed forever. Orders from Washington and London were clear. All German prisoners of war, men and women alike, would eventually be repatriated. The camps were never meant to be permanent homes. They were temporary way stations until Germany could take its people back. But for the women who had spent months, some years, behind American fences, the order split them in two. Some accepted their fate. They packed what little they had, folded up the clothes issued by the camp, and prepared to board trains once more. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They knew what awaited them: hunger, ruins, uncertainty, but they felt they had no choice. Their families were there, or what was left of them. To return was painful, but to refuse felt like abandonment. Others, however, resisted with all the quiet strength they could muster. They pleaded with guards, begged officers, even wrote petitions in broken English. "Please let us stay. We are safe here." One guard in Oklahoma recalled a young woman clutching his sleeve as she whispered, "My town is gone. My mother dead. If you send me back, I have nothing." He did not know what to say. He was a soldier following orders, not a man who could grant mercy. But her words haunted him for the rest of his life. The divide grew sharper as the day of departure drew near. In the barracks, arguments broke out between those resigned to leaving and those desperate to remain. Some accused the others of cowardice. "You must face what is left." "Germany needs us." Others shot back bitterly. "There is no Germany left, only ruins." The trains that carried them eastward told the story more starkly than any letter could. Some women sat rigid, staring out the windows, memorizing the American landscape they might never see again. Green fields, tidy farmhouses, neon-lit towns that glowed even at night. Others sobbed quietly, clutching hands, knowing each mile brought them closer to a world of rubble and hunger. For a few, destiny offered another path. Some managed to stay in America, through marriage to American soldiers, through immigration after the war, through rare exceptions granted on humanitarian grounds. These women would later speak of how captivity had been the doorway to an entirely new life, one they never could have imagined when the war began. But for the majority, return was unavoidable. They stepped off the trains in a Germany they barely recognized. The streets were hollowed shells, families broken, the air thick with smoke and despair. Many wrote later that the moment they saw their homeland again, they understood why their hearts had begged to remain in America. The divide between those who returned and those who found ways to stay marked the women forever. For some, it was the beginning of rebuilding, a slow climb out of ruin. For others, it was the memory of safety behind barbed wire, safety they would never know again. It was a cruel irony that captivity in America had offered comfort, while freedom in Germany brought only loss. And yet, within that divide lies the deeper lesson of their story. War does not end with surrender. Its shadows stretch long, into the choices ordinary people must make, into the tears shed not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments after. History books often reduce war to battles, generals, and treaties. But in the quiet corners, in the barracks, in the train cars, in the letters written on scraps of paper, we find the truths that statistics can never capture. The story of the German women prisoners who begged to remain in America is one of those truths. It forces us to confront a paradox, that freedom, the very thing most prisoners dream of, can sometimes be more frightening than captivity. For these women, the barbed wire fences of America did not only confine them, they shielded them. They offered steady meals, protection from violence, and even glimpses of kindness from their captors. Behind those fences, they rediscovered laughter, music, and, most of all, safety. Freedom, on the other hand, meant walking back into a homeland stripped bare. Freedom meant hunger gnawing at their bellies, bombed-out homes, and a future clouded by fear. For many, the word home had lost all meaning. What their story teaches us is that war does not simply end with surrender. When the guns fall silent, the wounds remain, in cities reduced to rubble, in families torn apart, and in hearts that no longer know where they belong. It also reveals the limits of propaganda. For years, these women had been told that Americans were monsters, brutal and merciless. Yet it was in American camps that they found dignity, food, and safety. Their tears at the thought of returning home were not only about fear of ruins, but also about the shock of realizing the enemy had shown them more mercy than their own leaders ever had. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: humanity survives even in the harshest conditions. In a Kansas field, a guard handing over an apple bridged a gap no propaganda could maintain. In a barracks lit by a single bulb, German and American voices sang Silent Night together across the wire. Those small acts did not erase the horrors of the war, but they proved that compassion can exist even between enemies. For older Americans who lived through those years, this story may stir memories of ration books, blackouts, and young men marching off to war. For younger generations, it is a reminder that war's greatest tragedies are not always found on the battlefield, but in the lives forever altered by choices no one should have to make. The women's refusal of freedom tells us something profound about the human cost of war, that survival is not just about living through battles, but about what comes after, when the world you return to no longer feels like home. When the American officers told the German women, "You can go home," they expected joy. What they received instead was silence, tears, and pleas to remain behind barbed wire. It was a moment that revealed one of the deepest tragedies of the Second World War, that sometimes home no longer exists when the war is over. These women's stories are not about battles or strategy. They are about survival, about the human spirit trying to endure when the ground beneath it has been scorched. Behind American fences, they tasted safety and even kindness. Beyond those fences lay only ruins, hunger, and fear. Their refusal to return home forces us to see war in a different light. Victory does not always mean celebration, and freedom does not always bring peace. For many, the hardest battles begin when the guns fall silent. Today, their story stands as a reminder of the cost of conflict, not just in destroyed cities and lost lives, but in shattered identities and broken definitions of home. It teaches us that even in war, humanity can flicker in unexpected places. In an apple passed through a fence, in the sound of carols sung by former enemies, in the compassion that survived when ideology failed. As we reflect on their tears, we also reflect on the fragile thread that binds us all together, enemies one day, human beings the next. And so, when we hear those words, "You can go home," we are reminded that the meaning of home is not walls or borders. It is safety, dignity, and belonging. For those women in 1945, America's prison camps, with all their fences and guards, offered more of that than the devastated homeland waiting across the sea. This is the untold story of German women prisoners who begged not for freedom, but for the chance to remain captives in a foreign land, because captivity in America felt safer than liberty in Germany. If this story moved you, help us keep these memories alive. Subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone who values history, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden human stories of the Second World War. Because history is not just about dates and battles, it's about people and their voices, even when whispered from behind barbed wire, still speak to us today. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in their place? Step into the ruins of Germany, or stay behind American fences where safety was certain? Share your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, give it a like. It really helps us reach more history lovers. And don't forget to subscribe, because we've got more untold World War II stories coming. Stories of courage, tragedy, and survival that you won't want to miss. Click on the next video, and let's keep uncovering the human side of history together.